Hello, I'm Oliver Colling, and this is my 70s TV childhood. Welcome back to my 70s TV childhood. We are a podcast dedicated to taking listeners back to the golden age of a British 70s childhood. To a time of orange and beige clothes, avocado bathroom suites, and the 3-day week, but also to a time that I and many of our listeners remember fondly, because it was when we had our childhoods. It was also a golden age for television, not necessarily because everything we watched was great, far from it, but television was a unifying cultural reference point across families, friends, and the workplace. Don't forget, this was an age before streaming and catch-up, and even before video recorders for most of us. So TV had a vitality and immediacy in a way it hasn't had, I don't think, before or since. If you wanted to watch a television programme, you needed to sit down at the appointed time, and if you didn't see it, you missed it. If this is your first time listening, then welcome. And if you're a regular listener, then thanks for your support. It really means a lot. As our regular listeners know, I've been a bit behind in dealing with my bulging digital postbag, but I've been able to catch up a bit this week. If you have been in touch, I most heartily thank you. As I've been catching up, I can't mention everyone who's been in touch, but I'll mention a few. Thanks to Mark in Australia for dropping me a line via our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com to say he found the show by listening to our episode on Survivors, the first series of which he originally saw in the UK before he and his parents emigrated to Australia. We've got quite a large audience in Australia and New Zealand now, so thanks Mark for adding to our number. Welcome also to Julia, who left a comment on our Facebook page, letting us know she'd just discovered the podcast and was busy working her way through the back catalogue. I'm so glad you found us, Julia. Thanks to Kathy, who got in touch via Facebook to thank us for the podcast. Very kind of you, Kathy. And as I've said before, just getting so much engagement from listeners makes the work that it takes to keep the podcast going feel really worthwhile. Also thanks to all of you who've been in touch via email to oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. Once again, there are too many of you to mention you all, but I will mention Sue, who is a regular listener, but was prompted to get in touch as we celebrated our 100th episode recently. Sue is also from the northwest of England, like me, so it's nice to have similar memories of childhood. If you're like Sue and have been thinking about getting in touch, I'd say don't hesitate. We'd love to hear from you. Now, it may surprise some of our regular listeners, but we do actually have a forward production plan at My 70s TV Childhood, rather than my winging it on a weekly basis. Although sometimes events mean I have to change the schedule at relatively short notice. That happened this time last year, when we had planned an episode to celebrate the 50th birthday of one of my favourite TV shows from the 1970s. This episode is scheduled to be released on the 30th of April 2024, which won't mean much to you if you're listening on catch-up in the future. And that date marks the 51st anniversary of the first episode of this show being broadcast. Yes, it's 51 years since The Tomorrow People hit our screens, broadcast by ITV on 30th of April 1973. I remember watching that first episode, even though I was only 6 years old, and being mesmerised by it from the opening music and the graphics that went with it, including a fist opening its fingers, a fetus and lots of rather weird pictures. That opening episode was unsettling, mysterious, and, frankly, a bit scary. A young boy, Stephen, played by Peter Vaughan Clark, suddenly becomes aware that he can hear all sorts of voices and other people's thoughts as he's walking through a market in London. Other young people are also tuning into his thoughts, and ultimately he collapses, only to be rescued by the mysterious Tomorrow People. It was all a bit confusing and rather threatening. Who were these mysterious young people who grabbed hold of Stephen? Even by the end of the first episode, it wasn't entirely clear, but crucially, it left you wanting to find out, and I dutifully tuned in to the next episode a week later. It turned out that Stephen was one of a group of people who were evolving into the next stage of human development to become Homo superior, or the Tomorrow People. Stephen had experienced what they referred to as breaking out, which meant recognising his telepathic and other special skills, which included being able to teleport at any given time. Now, that was the bit that really grabbed my attention. Teleportation? That would be absolutely brilliant, wouldn't it? The Tomorrow People were helped by having teleportation or jaunting belts, which allow them to get their teleporting right. I guess it'd be a bit embarrassing if you teleported to the wrong place. They held onto their belts and said jaunt, which allowed them to teleport. Now, I do remember hours of fun in the playground at primary school playing Tomorrow People and holding the belt in my school trousers and shouting, jaunt. And don't try and tell me I wasn't the only one doing that. In the first series, as well as Stephen, we had John, played by Nicholas Young, who was supposed to be 17, but looked even to me as a 6-year-old like he was close to 30. He was the de facto leader of the Tomorrow People gang, and was the common feature in all of the 8 series of the show. He was joined by Carol, played by Sammie Winmill, and Kenny, played by Stephen Salmon. Carol was a feisty, very 70s type of girl, who often dressed in trendy clothes like flared trousers, and she wore a big Afghan woolly coat, I seem to remember. She too was probably closer to 30 than 20, but that didn't matter in the land of 70s TV, where supposed teenagers were often played by actors who were clearly much older. Carol was also, I think, my first TV crush. Kenny was remarkable for 2 reasons. Firstly, as the youngest Tomorrow person, he was always left behind at their base, known as the Lab. Oh, I haven't mentioned that, have I? Rather excitingly and highly improbably, the Lab was based in a disused London Underground station and also housed the gang's sort of biocomputer, if that's a word, who was called Tim, T-I-M, which probably stood for something, but I can't remember. Tim, who was essentially a disembodied voice and a few flashing lights, probably due to the ludicrously small budget the show was made with, had been built by John, the leader of the group, with a bit of help from the Galactic Federation. Oh, didn't I mention them either? Well, the highly developed telepaths were part of an intergalactic federation of similar types of people. It's already a bit confusing, isn't it? And I still haven't got to the second point about Kenny, which was that he couldn't act to save his life. Even as a child, you could tell he was just going through the motions, and it was no surprise that Kenny didn't make it into Series 2. There were also 2 non-Tomorrow people, Ginge and Lefty, who were a couple of bikers, who had first been working with one of the group's enemies before switching sides to help out our heroes. Over the 13 episodes of the first series, we got to know all of the characters quite well. And then, when the next series began, we had a bit of a reshuffle. In fact, that became a running theme, as, with the exception of John, there seemed to be a revolving door ushering in new Tomorrow people whilst quietly expelling others. So when Series 2 began, Kenny and Carol disappeared, having, apparently, been sent to be Earth's ambassadors to the Galactic Federation, a plot device which was to be used several more times in the future to dispatch unwanted Tomorrow people. In truth, Sammie Winmill feared she might be typecast if she stayed, and Stephen Salmon was such an awful actor that some of the crew had threatened to quit if he wasn't given the push. I suppose that's the kind of thing people mean when they talk about artistic differences. I was gripped by the first series of the Tomorrow People. I was a loyal fan throughout the whole of its 6-year run. I even had a full set of the Piccolo paperback books which accompanied the series. Looking back, it was powerful drama, although it did tend to get a bit complicated. The idea for the show came from Roger Price, a producer at Granada TV who offered the show to his employers in 1970. They turned it down, as did Southern TV after them, and eventually he managed to sell his idea to Thames Television, who were looking for a show to compete with the BBC's Doctor Who. Price seemed more interested in an outlet where he could explore various ideas and types of drama, which probably explains some of the slightly bizarre storylines which came up in the show. Series 2 introduced the character of Elizabeth Mbondo, played by Elizabeth Adair. Now this time there was no pretense that she was a teenager, as she was first shown as a school teacher before discovering her powers. She was also quite significant by being a black female acting lead in a popular TV series, and, in a way, she was breaking ground for a new generation of female black actors. Oh, she could also act, which set her aside from Kenny at least. Elizabeth was a recurring character across several series, like John, who I think was in every series of the show, but I can't remember all of the other characters, who seemed to come and go with alarming speed. Ginge and Lefty disappeared without any explanation, and Tyso, a young gypsy telepath, burst into the series at one point, and then, equally mysteriously, vanished again. I also remember that at one point a Japanese Tomorrow person was introduced, but she could barely speak English and her acting skills were on a par with Kenny's, so I don't think she lasted very long either. But what are the stories, I hear you say? Well, they range from gritty, quite scary storylines to quite bizarre tangents to the main show. Many people unfairly judge the show by a story called A Man for Emily, which was, if you remember it, utterly ridiculous. It featured the first TV appearance of Peter Davidson, later to be Tristram in All Creatures Great and Small and Doctor Who himself, but playing one of a group of cannibal aliens who visit Earth looking for some food, i.e. humans, to eat. Their knowledge of Earth has been gained by watching a few Western films, so they all speak with a southern drawl, and Davidson's character goes to Earth dressed as a cowboy. All very odd. And the plot develops with one of the aliens taking a shine to boring old John, and pursuing him to be her mate. And that means literally to mate with him, after which, just like a spider, she will eat him. Eventually, I seem to recall, the aliens are persuaded to give up their cannibalistic ways, and they ended up settling down in the East End to live a more simple life. But I could be dreaming that. I'm sure one of our listeners would be able to tell me. It was also a bit strange that in and amongst some of the storylines which were truly menacing and scary for kids, we had that one storyline which was really a camp comedy romp. Most odd. I think my favourite stories were those with a bit of menace. In Hitler's Last Secret from 1978, the story revolves around a youth craze for wearing Nazi uniforms. I kid you not. And it is inspired by Nazis who are looking to regenerate Hitler, who has been cryogenically frozen since the Second World War. Hang on. This sounds just like the plot from the first episode of The New Avengers that we covered in a recent podcast episode. There was a lot of Nazi-related stuff in the 1970s, and I suppose the war wasn't that long beforehand if you look at it. Anyway, back to the plot. Hitler turns out to be a shape-shifting evil alien who's been on the run from the Galactic Federation for centuries. Of course he is. Incidentally, Hitler was played by Michael Sheard, who's better known as Mr. Bronson from Grange Hill. And I remember his turning into the alien monster as being suitably gruesome and perfect for 10-year-olds watching. The storyline also produced this wonderful line. Hitler isn't dead. Hitler is Niebuhr from the planet Vashir, a galactic shape-changing psychopath. Well, that's all right then, that explains everything. My personal favourite was a story called A Rift in Time, which featured time travel, always a favourite of mine in 1970s TV, and several trips into the past and into the future. The basic premise, I seem to remember, was that a youth had gone back to Roman Britain with the design of an early steam engine, and, as a result, the Roman Empire had never fallen and the future was dominated by the Roman eagle. I love the fact that in one sequence, the Tomorrow people, I'm not sure which ones it was, go back to 1974 to find that the Romans are still running the world. A Centurion laughs at the fact that, in our timescale, we got to the moon in 1969, whereas in his parallel universe, the Roman eagle was planted on the moon 3 centuries ago, complete with demonic laughter. how to save the day was a bit of a dilemma, as one of the central things about the Tomorrow People, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, was that they were not allowed to intentionally kill, and the only way of changing time back was to go back in time and eliminate the young lad who's gone back with the steam engine plans. You still with me? Well, just bear with it for another minute or two. As luck turns out, whoever it was who went back ends up knocking out the youth, and TV's best medical plot device, amnesia, saves the day. He can't remember the design for the steam engine. So the undefeated Roman Empire never happens, and all is restored to normal. Hurrah! As I've recounted that plot, it does all sound absolutely ridiculous. But it was gripping and great fun. I'm sure many of you love the show as well, and remember lots of different episodes. It ran until 1979, so it had a pretty good innings. As with so many shows, though, it seemed to run out of steam a bit towards the end. The revolving door of Tomorrow People was a bit distracting, but I suppose as kids just lived with it and enjoyed the next bizarre storyline. I also still, to this day, would love to know how to jaunt. That would be so cool. What memories do you have of the Tomorrow People? Let me know by commenting on our blog at www.my70stvchildhood.com or on our Twitter/X, Facebook, YouTube or LinkedIn pages. You can also drop me an email if you prefer to oliver@my70stvchildhood.com. We'd love to hear from you. Unfortunately, I can't time travel, so you'll have to wait a fortnight until our next episode, or just a week for the next edition of our 70s-related TV trivia quiz. In the meantime, don't forget to like, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell your friends about us. For now then, take care, and join us again soon for more from My 70s TV Childhood.